Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is a bonus episode about persuasion. We're known on this show for our balanced discussions and nonpartisan approach, so today's guest might surprise you. Karin Tamerius, a progressive and the founder of Smart Politics, is joining us to share her unique perspective on political dialogue. She's helped develop tools and teaches skills to help progressives influence and persuade others without imposing their beliefs. Now, you might be wondering, why have a dyed-in-the-wool progressive on a show dedicated to balanced views and nonpartisanship? Well, the answer lies in Dr. Tamerius' approach. Even though her movement is attempting to persuade and ultimately, quote, create a more progressive world, end quote, she's a champion of science-backed communication strategies that respect the dignity of everyone involved, regardless of their political beliefs. From the Smart Politics website, it's about, quote, building strong, healthy relationships with people who disagree with us, end quote. Karin's work is a testament to the idea that even in a deeply divided landscape, respectful, persuasive conversations are still possible. And that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckemeyer, and I'm guessing even if you don't share Karin's political leanings, you'll find her insights into productive communication valuable. I once heard Dr. Tamerius assert that the deep division, the toxic polarization we often talk about on this show, hurts progressives more than it hurts conservatives. So I opened the conversation exploring that question. Be sure to stay all the way to the end, where you're going to learn about Angry Uncle. I was really curious when you said, that this division hurts
progressives more than it hurts conservatives. Yeah,
I had never heard that, and which I'm kind of surprised about for all the people that I've talked to. So I'm really curious to sort of, explore that.
Yeah, my thinking about it is simply that progressives are more oriented toward change, and the more divided and polarized we are, the more paralyzed we are. Change requires coalitions. It requires us to, get stuff through Congress in order to make it happen. And right now, we are completely paralyzed. And even when we succeed and, have control of the presidency and have even control of the House and Senate, our ability to pass legislation in any significant way is really, we're in a terrible bind.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, I think very much that it works to the advantage of conservatives who are much less interested in significant change.
Yeah, and I guess particularly if you think about traditionalists, it's sort of, I guess the only change they want is to go backwards, if you really talk about, if you go as far as to the traditionalist side. But I guess, that's just a fundamental element of conservatives is to go a little slower, which always did have like a positive, there was always room for progressives having that conservative anchor a little bit because that would maybe keep progressives from getting out in front of their skis, right?
Sure.
But when it turns into complete obstruction, I guess it starts to be, and that's one of the effects. It's, the political scientists talk about that. It's one of the effects of a polarized world is that you just start to be, you start to have a lot less, effectiveness in government, right? There's not much government to do.
Congress can't work. That's why it's like, what is its popularity right now? Down to like 10% or something, absurd. And it's because it's a broken institution.
And I'd argue it's worse than just because the Congress can't decide anything. That kind of makes major parts of democracy and the Constitution broken too, because Congress has a role in, affecting or enforcing things that are in the Constitution. And if they decide not to do it or can't do it because you can't get a 2/3 vote for anything, then those parts of the Constitution might as well not exist.
Yeah. So we're in a real bind right now. But I think it works against progressives more than it works against conservatives. Yeah.
Just primarily because there's sort of an agenda to move forward, and it kind of can get held back more than sort of the right amount of being held back.
Yeah, yeah,
so
absolutely. So, which is why I think you see conservatives being much more satisfied with a paralyzed Congress than, much more willing to risk government shutdowns, much more willing to obstruct. It's, they don't, the price they're paying just isn't that high. Unlike progressives who, we're supposed to be providing services. We're supposed to be moving, getting health care. We're supposed to be getting more infrastructure. We're supposed to be, making abortion accessible again. We're not accomplishing any of those things right now.
Well, and I would think, and maybe I'm getting it wrong, but I would think you would be sort of upset as I am at those on the progressive side, particularly. I'm talking about political elites now, that sort of help continue this divisiveness, right? I mean, it seems like I would like to see more. Tell me what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, not how terrible this other person is.
Well, so this is where I'm not as critical of the elites, I think, as a lot of other people. I think our political system in its current state has put elites in a bind where they are responding to the incentives in a very rational way. And the incentives in our system are to be as divisive as possible, to be as negative as possible, because that's how you get reelected. And and that is driven primarily by gerrymandering, right? The majority of districts in the country are like who wins the primary is the primary election. It's not the general election. It's who wins the primary. And because those districts are overwhelmingly conservative or overwhelmingly progressive, and the people who vote in primaries are the most extreme members of the party, that means that the people who are being represented are at the farthest ends of the political spectrum. And so they get to Congress, and you have people with just very who are very distant in their political beliefs, and their constituencies are incredibly different in their political beliefs. And it's very hard for them to collaborate and be able to possibly get reelected. They know if they cooperate with the Republicans on the issue, or if for the Republicans, if they cooperate with the Democrats, they are not going to be reelected. Mm-hmm. So that is a very difficult bind to be in. But what it's resulted in, which I don't think a lot of people realize, is that if you look at the ideological distribution of members of Congress, it is very polarized. And that's a first in American history. Like right now, there is very little overlap between people on the left and the right. In contrast, if you look at the ideological distribution in the American public, it's still a normal distribution. Like most people fall very much in the center of the political spectrum. So we have a Congress that does not align with the attitudes of the American public. And that is mostly tied to gerrymandering at this point.
Yeah, and let's make sure we may make that clear to the audience a little bit there too, because I think it's certainly gerrymandering is obviously a huge factor. There's also some just amount of separation. What's the word that we always use that gets used all the time to say we've broken ourselves up a little bit as well. We've carved ourselves up along these lines as well a bit too. But yeah, you're right that almost every area is way more purple than the gerrymandering would indicate. And sometimes you can feel abandoned by that. But yeah, so what we're talking about is the way, like you said before, that the whole, and this has become so weaponized now, that the process is they're primarily trying to win the primary because they're what we call safe districts, and the number of safe districts has gone from, I think it was like about half or maybe less than half to now it's like 70 or 80%. It's like a really big number that are safe districts. There's a very small number of competitive districts anymore.
Right.
So it's all about winning those primaries and, and serving that red meat if you're on the red side, I guess. And I don't know what the equivalent of blue meat is, but the same idea.
Right.
And so that's kind of what we're talking about, just for the audience to make sure we get that. And that's and so, when we talk about trying to fix that, you run into that same problem that kind of it's a loop, right? Because if Congress can't do anything, then you can't fix that either.
Right. Well, and then you get into this situation where people become increasingly radicalized, right? Because the Republicans right now are running and have been for a long time on this notion that government is bad, right? Small government is good. And that is becoming tied up with the notion that government is just useless and broken and we can't accomplish anything. Therefore, we need a strong executive to accomplish all the things that government is incapable of doing, right? And that also is one of those things that's kind of serving the Republican narrative right now in terms of what they're headed for. It's we're getting an increasingly radicalized American public who are like, government's broken, it can't do anything. The only solution is burn the system down and replace it with something new, or bring in an authoritarian leader who can make things happen.
Internationally, there's such a precedent of this because it's occurred in other places around the world where that kind of thinking got, and you would think, I guess part of it is we've had it so easy here for so long in some ways. I mean, it's sort of like we don't really understand what not having some of these freedoms is like. And we complain about, I mean, we throw around this language like this person's a dictator or that person is, but we have no idea. Right? We have not really seen what that is. Like pretty much the entire country's lifetime, but certainly in any of our lifetimes, we haven't really seen those kind of threats, maybe not since World War II. And so I think we get a little bit lax about it, but I think people have a hard time appreciating how difficult it would be to rebuild it if we do let those institutions fall apart. And you certainly have people that are very explicit about this. I mean, you sort of have the Bannons of the world, and he's got a whole following about this that really believes. And you've got this whole tech bro thing that seemed to buy into this as well, of somehow we need to tear everything down for some reason. And then you've just got the average person who you can totally appreciate how they could feel this way. They get this message that everything's complicated. The government had this problem and that problem, and this person comes along and says, don't worry about all that complicated stuff. I can fix it. And of course, that's a very appealing message. And everybody that's ever done that, around the world and in history, that has not gone well as long as we've had governments where people could do that, going back to Roman times and even before. So it's like, it's kind of funny that we're so ready to do it again. Like, this has never worked, not one time.
Right. Exactly. And there is a certain irony associated with it, which is, where we're hearing this message a lot right now is on the right. And traditionally conservatives, want to preserve institutions. They don't want radical change. They want things to go slowly. And yet, and yet at some point, I guess there comes a frustration level and a breaking point that's just like, no, it's not working anymore. So we're going to tear it down. And I end up, on the left being like, no, yes, it is broken. It's really, really broken, but it would be so much worse if we tore it down. There are so many things that are working right that we don't even think about. that will be demolished if we let that happen. And but it's also important to keep in mind that there are people on the left who sometimes, if they're far enough left, also sort of fall into that camp. So this isn't something that is exclusive to the right. And one of the things I really like to keep in mind are the studies of support for political violence in the United States. And really, if you, the people on the left and right are not that different when it comes to political violence. There's a certain percentage of the public on both sides of the political spectrum who are like, yeah, I would use violence at a certain point. And that's scary.
So, taking it in another direction with your work with the sort of the MAGA, it's not too late sort of work. I really like the material that you're presenting and the way you're doing it. And I know when I've had conversations, sometimes trying to talk people off the ledge, and sometimes often progressives, they can fall into a lot of these traps, and they can really start, with this mentality. So one thing that I see that's very common is they kind of want the magic pill, right? I just have to have this pill. I can grab this person by the scruff of the neck and shake the rightness into them,
Right.
and shake the right ideas into their head. And it's very hard to get past that. Like, how do they just not see how crazy they are or whatever, and I don't know, you must experience that. And I imagine some people maybe even drop out of your work because they can't get there. But I mean, it seems like you must be able to affect that change in people that they can see beyond that, or you wouldn't keep doing it. So I want to take that as like a success story.
Right. No, it definitely happens. And it usually takes them actually going out there and having at least one conversation using the persuasion conversation cycle. Like, that is the most important thing. And they really, if they stick to the cycle and they have a whole conversation with someone, that's usually enough to persuade them that it works. Like, they'll come back to me and say, that conversation was a totally different experience than any other conversation I've had. And it's not like they have the conversation and the person changes their minds or anything like that. But there's a level of engagement that helps them understand where the other person is coming from, and helps them see that they're actually a very, rational person, and that they care and they're not crazy, and all of these, things that we think about people on the other side, that kind of, it cuts through the stereotypes, and they're able to connect at an emotional level. And once that happens, they can see how change is possible. So that makes a huge difference. When people haven't done that yet, what I find to be most helpful are analogies, things that people can relate to, experiences that they've had in their own lives where change has really taken a while, but they knew it was possible, and they hung in there. So an example would be someone who is, like, let's say they're in a bad marriage, right? It can take a really long time for someone who's in a bad marriage to leave it, even if it's obvious to everyone around them that, this isn't working for you, this is making you miserable. Why don't you understand that this person isn't treating you well, perhaps is being abusive? And the way that change happens is, that person has to figure it out for themselves, right? They have to, you can't force them to come to the realization that this marriage is bad for them. You can't go and just say, this marriage is bad for you, you need to leave now. Nobody's gonna respond positively to that. They're probably going to stop talking to you if you engage with them that way. Instead, you need to go to them and be like, it looks like you're really struggling right now. How can I help? And be there for them. And when they trust you about it, they're going to open up and talk more, and you're going to be the place where they can process those emotions and their fears and their hopes, and they can talk about the possibility of what life would be like if they left the marriage, and you can talk about how you'll be there for them no matter what they decide to do. So when you think about that, it becomes easier to understand that what we're asking people to do when it comes to making a dramatic change in their political attitudes, it's often equivalent to leaving a long-term personal relationship. It's not something people can do easily, and it's not something that you can just tell someone to do, even if it really is in their best interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And, and I don't know, this might be a bad word for the work that you're doing, but do you ever talk to folks about them going into the conversation prepared for the idea that their mind might be changed?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's really important. There are certain values underlying our work, and I know I can't list them all off on the top of my head, but open-mindedness and humility are incredibly important. We do not, I have an idea of what's best. I have political beliefs, and I am a political advocate, but I'm just one human being. And there's nothing that makes me superior to any person that I'm talking to. It is entirely possible that they have ideas that are better than mine. And they certainly have had experiences that are different from mine. And they are the person who needs to make their own decision. That is not my place. And democracy does not work if each of us tells those of us around us what to do. It works when each person comes to their own decision, decides what's best for them. So, yeah, I go into every conversation with the expectation that my mind could be changed. And honestly, it does change in subtle ways, probably as a result of every conversation. I come out of every dialogue having learned something important. I am changed.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. And something that I think we saw with the pandemic, but I think we saw also sort of in the Trump years, which I guess we're still in the Trump years, what is it, 10 years now?
Yeah.
Where it's sort of like we may have our red line issues, and there may be things we're not ready to change our mind on, or we feel like that's like we've turned that into a value and we're not ready to change on that. But sometimes if someone else disagrees with that one issue, we sort of throw them out, the person, and then we're not going to have any conversations about any other issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's another thing that I try to stress with people, that I think you can still have we can't maybe come to agreement on this. We're going to disagree about that maybe forever. We still might have some conversation there, because there still might be a little bit more gray than you think there is. But we don't have to make that like life or death about everything else, that there still may be other things we can either agree on, or at least have a bigger dialogue about it and learn from each other about. And that's another one where I think a lot of us were in those modes. If you didn't believe in vaccines, we're not going to have any, you're going to be removed from my life or whatever.
Right.
And on all these kinds of red lines that we were drawing. And I always try to talk to people about keeping the number of things you're on a red line like that to a minimum, if possible. But it's not bad. It's not the worst thing to have a thing like that. That can happen. I get it. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. But be open beyond that person isn't evil if they don't agree on that one value. And there still may be a lot of room for other ways to learn from each other.
Absolutely. There are always ways to learn from each other. And one of the things that I always emphasize is staying connected to people as much as possible. because you can't influence someone you are not connected to.
So let's talk about Angry Uncle.
Yeah, Angry Uncle has been a lot of fun. I developed the first iteration for the New York Times back in 2017, and it was for helping people have conversations at the dinner table over the holidays, right? But that was like a very it was almost a choose your adventure, but sort of, there was no AI component. So, fast forward now to 2024, and I've created an Angry Uncle bot that actually will talk with you about any political subject that you want. You can set its difficulty level to from anywhere from annoying to apoplectic. And it's a great way to practice having really difficult conversations without any risks. So when you go out into the real world, there's always a risk. There's emotional stress. It's possible you'll say the wrong thing and make somebody mad. So why not practice with a chatbot that gives you an opportunity to make all those mistakes? And yes, the chatbot will get mad at you when you make the mistakes, but it's just a chatbot. And there's also, while you're having the conversation with Angry Uncle, there's a guide who's modeled on me who provides you with tips on how to improve your conversation. Because a lot of times people, they get to a point in the dialogue and they're like, I don't know what to say next, or everything they say makes the Angry Uncle mad. So it helps to have someone step in and say, hey, what Angry Uncle really needs right now is some validation. He needs to know that you appreciate how he's feeling. And so you step in, let the Angry Uncle know how, that you see he's suffering, and offer some compassion. And suddenly he becomes, a little more amenable to hearing what you have to say. And the really exciting part of it to me was being able to gamify it. So people can really, if you're really following the kinds of practices I teach for having good conversations, you're really listening, you're really reflecting back what he says, you're finding areas of common ground, and you're sharing personal stories rather than making arguments with facts and evidence. Over time, he will actually start to change his mind a little bit, and you can usually come to some kind of compromise about the best way forward.
Interesting. Yeah, I love it. I mean, I think it's super cool. It's funny because I do, I have done a lot of interviews and I try to always, discover, come across folks that are different places on the spectrum. But, when I was going to also say, when I have those conversations, I'll spend a long time in that trust building phase, right? I mean, where I try not to ask any partisan questions really, and just get to know the person and ask them about and really just let them go on. Like, I don't interrupt and just let them go before I start getting into the harder questions,
Yes.
And I don't know if I don't know how, if people want to spend an hour talking to angry bot before they do that, but
yeah, people have told me it usually takes 20 to 30 minutes, a conversation with the bot, to get it to a place where you've had a complete conversation. And I think you're right. With a real person, you probably spend even longer than that in that trust building phase, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely get that. All right. Well, again, thanks so much for making the time to chat with me. I think that this is really enlightening. I think listeners are really going to enjoy it.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.